Well, good morning, everybody. How are we doing today? All right. Well, we are in the throes of summer, are we not? It's hot out there. There's a little thunderstorm in the air, and I know many of us are also in the middle of vacation season. Maybe you're coming back from vacation or planning a vacation or going on vacation. And I've talked about this before, but last summer, my wife and I, we went to London on vacation. And when you go to London, part of the experience is all about the royal family and going to see the palaces. So you hire tour guides, and they explain stuff to you. And it was kind of interesting to hear the different perspectives from the tour guides about the royal family in London. So some of the older tour guides kind of still hold the royal family in high regard. There was a lot of reverence and respect that was given to them. But when you talk to some of the younger ones, they were more like whatevs. They didn't care too much about the royal family, and they surely did not like that some of their tax dollars go and support the royal family when they're already rich. It's like their tax money goes to support what they do, which then led to a question that we kept asking everybody. What exactly do they do? We were trying to figure this out, to which really not one person could actually explain to us what it is that the royal family does. Maybe the best explanation I heard was from one guy who said, well, they're kind of like mascots, like Mickey and Minnie. They don't run Disney World. They're not trained in operations. They're not operating in the roller coaster, but yet you still hope to see them. You still hope to bump into them. So regardless of what the royal family actually does, people really are fascinated with them. And so one of the palaces that we went to was Kensington Palace. Now, we had previously gone to Windsor Castle, Windsor Palace, which was really, really cool. And so that day we were going to Kensington, I had already scheduled a live Peloton ride in the London studio with my favorite Peloton instructor. And so I was conflicted, trying to figure out what to do. And so I ended up canceling my live Peloton ride to go to Kensington Palace. This was a huge mistake, because my favorite instructor is Ben Aldis, and it was a really good playlist of music. And trading kind of this Peloton ride for Kensington Palace is kind of like trading a bowl of ice cream for sour cream. Sour cream is good, but not that much of it, and that's kind of how Kensington Palace was. It was kind of cool for about 5 minutes, and then I was like, really? This is it? Not as cool as I thought. Now, many of us know of Kensington Palace as the home of William and Kate, but why it's kind of famous and what you go to see when you go there is it's the birthplace of Queen Victoria, and it's the place where Queen Victoria grew up, and we've all heard of the Victorian era, that period of time. And that's all centered around her because she was extremely loved and very influential. She's actually so influential that she's still credited with influencing things in culture today. And so here are a few of the things that we still do in society because of Queen Victoria. Now, she didn't invent these things. She just kind of put them on the map or made them things that were popular that we all do, maybe how a social media influencer or a celebrity would influence culture. And so one of those things is wearing a white wedding dress. So why we wear white wedding dresses was because of her. Back in that time, when somebody got married, they would just wear their best dress, and most common for everybody was to have a dress of color, because to have a white dress, it was usually associated with the wealthy, not because of the color white, just because a white dress was hard to keep clean, and they would wear these dresses over and over. But when Queen Victoria wore the white wedding dress, that became the must-do thing. And now fast forward, here we are. We still wear white wedding dresses in society. Another one is Christmas trees in the home. There was a picture that went viral. It was in a London publication of Queen Victoria and her husband, Prince Albert, and their family decorating a Christmas tree. And when everyone saw them decorating this Christmas tree, this became something that everybody had to do. And here we are. We still bring Christmas trees into our home. And then there's a trend that's a little bit more tragic. Her husband, Prince Albert, he died relatively young. And after he died, she mourned the loss of her husband by wearing black. But she didn't wear black for a day. She didn't wear black for a week. She didn't wear black for a month. She wore black for 40 years. The rest of her life, 40 years she lived after her husband died, she was known to wear her grief in public. She kind of put this idea of public grief into the social specter. And so this idea then of public grieving became a part of the West and American culture all the way up until the mid-1900s. And so in 1941, when FDR lost his mother, he was extremely close and they had a tight relationship. He wore an armband on his sleeve, a black armband, to signify he was literally wearing his grief. And then a few months later, and we know what happened in December of 1941 when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, You see him here signing the declaration of war against Japan, and he's still wearing that armband. Once again, a public display of grief. Now, what's kind of ironic, according to a researcher who wrote a book, and this book just came out a couple years ago, it's called The Grief Cure. He states that this idea of public grieving started to wane in part due to World War II. Because so many people had died in the war that public grief was no longer seen as tenable or reasonable. And then in the 50s and 60s, this idea of grieving in public was seen as self-indulgent. So now you fast forward to modern society. There was a study done on grief by the National Park Service of all places. So Smokey the Bear wrote this. And look at its conclusion on grief. Death is now a private and not a public matter. Today, mourners are encouraged not to offend others by reminding them of their sorrow. The ritual of mourning is no longer part of modern life. Those who are grieving are treated affectionately, but now a great burden is placed on them. There is discouragement from expressing grief, and one must define one's own ritual, essentially figure out how to handle grief on their own, guided by their own feelings. So they feel alone, and they have to also now figure it out internally. So I think it's safe to say that we don't handle grief very well in modern society. We've all heard of the 5 stages of grief. It's shock or denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Well, there's this unspoken expectation that we better get to acceptance fast because you know what? It happened. And you can't change it, so put on a brave face and don't bother anyone else with it. You get your 2.5 days of bereavement at work, and then it's back to work, life moves on. But anyone who's lost anyone, that matters to them. Well, you know that's not how it works, which kind of makes this shift in our culture all the more odd because death is something that literally touches all of us and impacts all of us. So you'd think we'd be better at handling it, and we're simply not. Not to mention grieving, as anyone's going through that process, it's not linear. You may expect that it starts with numbness or shock and you're going to get to acceptance, but what you actually experience is chaos. Your emotions are all over the place. You don't know why or when or how you feel or what triggers your grief. You just feel like a boat that's caught in the ocean in the middle of a hurricane, and you're not sure what to do, but you surely feel alone. And where grief can be really tricky is when we think of grief, even today we hear that word, we think of it through the lens of death. But grief is much broader than that. We can actually feel grief when we lose anything that matters to us. It can be the death of a dream, the death of a goal, the loss of a job that mattered to you, the community that was associated with that job, the loss of a relationship, the loss of a friendship, the death of a marriage, and going through a divorce. Losing a pet, maybe a change in your health. You had big plans, but your health has hijacked your plans, or you had retirement goals and your health, or maybe your financial situation changed your goals in retirement and you're mourning the loss of those expectations. Maybe it's moving from your home. You know, I had a meeting a couple months ago with someone, and as I was talking to this person, they were extremely angry about an experience that they had had at a different church, a previous church. And there was some genuine church hurt there as they were fleshing out what they had experienced. And as I was talking to them, it became clear to me that they weren't just mad about what happened, but they were grieving the loss of that church community because that church mattered to them. Those relationships that they had at that church mattered to them. And so they were now grieving something that was important. And when they realized that they needed to not just be mad, but they also needed to grieve their anger, you could literally see it on their face. Their anger started to wane and this healing process could begin. But this shows us in part why grief is so hard for us to pinpoint because it actually shows up often in secondary emotions. We're mad or we're sad or we're languished or we're frustrated or we're exhausted. But all we know is that we're feeling feels, but we may not know that we're feeling those feels due to a broken heart. Now, we're in this series that we started a couple weeks ago where we're looking at Psalms from the heart. And if you were to look at kind of the entirety of the Psalms, there's 150 of them, and about a third of them are called laments. Laments. And lament means to cry, to weep. It even means to complain. And so to lament is to express your grief. And so today what I want to do is I want to look at a lament. It's Psalm chapter 13. And today we're going to be talking about lamenting or expressing our grief. And for maybe, I hope many of you in the room right now, this is a message that you don't need today. But because death impacts all of us, this is a message that all of you will need at some point. And Psalm 13 was written by a guy named David, and we talked about David last week. If you were here, we know he was an emotional guy. He was a passionate guy. And what we're going to see in Psalm 13 is he's a real honest guy. He gets really real, and he's not afraid to be raw with his emotions. And I think today in society, if we're going to learn to grieve better as a whole, or at bare minimum, grieve better as individuals, then I think we need to be okay to be getting honest with our emotions as well. To be real and to be raw. We need to be okay with this idea of feeling our feelings. Now, we tend to do one of two different things in our culture with our feelings. The first one is that we will say to people, you got to follow your feelings. Just follow your heart. Do what feels right. Do what feels good. And to some degree, your intuition can be helpful at times. If you were to walk in a strange city into a dark alley and you saw someone come out and you started to feel afraid, that feeling is called wisdom. You should listen to that feeling. That's a helpful feeling. But many of times our feelings, they don't tell us the right thing to do. Let's say you get in an argument with your boss at work, or they say something really stupid, or they're frustrating you. Your feelings may tell you to punch them in the face. The problem is somebody's like, yeah, hope your boss isn't here. If you follow those feelings, though, there's a word for that. It's called assault. And prisons are full of people who follow their feelings. Because feelings don't always tell you the right thing to do. On the flip side, some of us say, yeah, okay, I won't follow my feelings. I'll forget my feelings. I will eat my feelings. I will drink my feelings. I will stuff them down. I am a robot. I don't feel anything. There's one problem with that. You're not forgetting your feelings. You're numbing yourself. And when you numb yourself to your feelings, you run the risk of either developing bad habits or at some point having emotional breakdown. And so the Psalms, why they're so helpful is they show us a better way that we should face our feelings. And not just face our feelings, but give facts then to our feelings, because feelings aren't facts. I don't know if you know that or not. They're helpful. They're indicators. I've said this before, but they're like a check engine light. You should pop the hood and see why they're there, see what's happening, but don't be led by them. Don't ignore them, face them, and then inform them. Teach them, tell them the truth. And so as we dive into Psalm 13, we're going to see that David is deep in his feels. He's feeling his feelings. He's sad. He's hurt. He's grieving. And if you were here last week and we looked at Psalm 51, we had some context, which is to say we knew why David wrote Psalm 51. We don't have that same type of context here, but I'm really grateful for his honesty, because David is giving us a roadmap on how to face grief. And so let's just learn and dive in as we go. Psalm 13, let's begin. It says, for the director of music, a psalm of David. How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? So the first thing that we see here is he writes this psalm and he gives it to the director of music, because a psalm is a song. And what's the best way to process sometimes how we feel? Well, one of the ways we do that is through music. Music is kind of the language of our soul. And if you've ever experienced a bad breakup, you understand that. Because the breakup, going through it and the pain of the breakup, the music might help you feel better or help calm your soul or calm your mind, because the reality is you feel like you want to dig your key into the side of his pretty little souped up four-wheel drive. But you're not going to do that. You're going to sing it in song. You know you shouldn't follow your feelings. That's wrong. And so you put on a different Carrie Underwood song. You're like, Jesus, take the wheel. Take it from my life. But that's what music does. It helps us express what we feel. And that's what David's doing here. He's lamenting. He's expressing how he feels, and we see that here through a question that he keeps asking over and over. How long? How long? How long? How long? 4 times he asks God, how long must I continue feeling this way? We are not patient people. We've all asked that question before. How long? How long until we're there? Or how long until it's ready? Or how long is this going to take? And that's where David's at. He's worn out. He's exhausted. He's exasperated. God, how long am I going to feel this pain? How long am I going to feel this sorrow? And that's what you're seeing here. If you could put a word to this, really, this is just pain. He's in pain, or maybe you could call this despair. He feels somewhat hopeless, and he's just sinking down. In his pain and his despair, it runs so deep that he says he feels forgotten by God. He's like, God, have you hid your face from me? Are you ignoring me right now? It says his thoughts are plaguing him. He's wrestling with his thoughts. He's having these intrusive thoughts, these ridiculous thoughts, and sorrow has consumed his heart. He asks, is my enemy going to triumph over me? He's got all these real enemies, and he feels like they're getting victory. Really, what he feels like is he's just spiraling down into the pit of pain and the pit of despair. And that's how we feel when we're grieving. Is that we're just spiraling, that we're lost, that grief itself is our enemy and it's gloating over us. You'll never beat me. You're going to feel this way forever. And our soul is like, I don't want to feel this way. Why is it taking so long? Lord, turn your face back towards me. And here's what I want us to understand today. This is in the Bible, the real, the raw, the gritty, the sad, the honest. It's here. Now, if I were writing a holy book and I was going to create a religion, I would leave stuff like this out. But God does not. This is not left out. And so why this matters is because it's showing you that you have permission to wrestle with and even question God and yet still be in relationship with him. For you to wrestle with your emotions, to cry out to God is not rebellion, it's relational authenticity. And what God wants from you is relational authenticity. And relationally, authentically speaking, life sucks sometimes. And to pretend otherwise, or to pretend with God, it's like, put on a happy face, is not real. And you don't have to pretend with God that life doesn't suck, that it is hard. You can cry out to him, and you're not going to hurt his feelings. You're not going to offend him. When you're being honest with him, you have biblical permission because this is here to feel what you feel and vent it back to God. And notice God doesn't defend himself. He doesn't feel the need to jump in and argue back. He allows us to process our feelings in his presence, which is one of the great things about God. And I will say, because the church is really the hands and feet, the extension of Jesus into this world, and we can help people and minister to people the same way God does by being present. Because God is always with us, and in the same way, if somebody is grieving or they feel lost or they're going through something hard, one of the main things that they need from us as a church community or from you as a friend is simply your presence. Now, many of times, because we're not too good at handling grief in society, we may shy back, or we may avoid because we don't know what to say or what to do, but you don't have to have all of the answers. And this is why spiritual community is so powerful. It's just the presence of God's people bringing hope around us. You see, when Job had lost everything, his friends came and they just sat with him. And their presence alone brought comfort. But there was a shift that happened in their relationship. There was a point when their friends thought they did have to have all the answers. And they began to judge him or question him, and they actually gave him really bad advice. And you don't have to try to always give advice. The Bible doesn't give simple answers, and so we don't have to either. But I will say, some of us, not all of us, but some of us are so quick to try to offer a platitude to someone to help them in their grieving process, because we think if we say the right word or the magic phrase, they'll be able to get out of that grieving process faster, and we mean well, but some of the things that we say are simply not helpful, or they're just flat out wrong. We'll say things like, well, God just needed another angel in heaven, and so God must have took him, or this was God's plan. And you have to understand, first of all, that's not how it works. People don't become angels. We are different beings. And second of all, why would God take them, or why would God need another angel in heaven when we needed him here? When I needed him on earth? And last I checked, death was not part of God's plan. The sin and the brokenness and the corruption of this world, this was not God's design. The enemy came to steal, kill, and destroy. He corrupted what God created. Cancer is not part of God's plan. Now, thank God that he did something. He didn't leave us in the mess. He did something to fix the sin and the brokenness and the evil that's in this world. But he didn't want this. And so God didn't take them. Sin, evil, and death took them. And as a pastor, I've had lots of conversations with people, or people who have grown up, when somebody well-meaning said something to them that made them think that God literally killed their family member, that God took somebody out of their life. And what happens is that actually drove a wedge in their relationship with God, because the one that they're supposed to go to for comfort is the one that they should blame for taking somebody out of their story. Now, if you've ever said this, I'm not trying to make you feel bad. I'm really not. But if you've ever said this and you mean well, I think the reason we do this, it all goes back to what I said earlier. It's because we don't handle grief well in society. We want people to get to acceptance fast. And we think if we say the right thing at the right time, that it will help people. And so I know it's coming from a good place, but the thing that will help them the most is your presence. And your presence will speak far louder than any phrase that you can say. Now, all that being said, there is a time in the grieving process for truth. There is a time for us to maybe offer advice. There is a time for counsel, and that can be tricky to discern, but I'll tell you this, that time comes after we allow people to feel their feelings. Because sometimes when people are feeling their feelings, you even look at what David said. He's like, God, did you turn your face towards me? Somebody will be like, well, theologically, God's always looking at us, right? We'll try to, it seems like nonsense if you think about it theologically, but God wants our nonsense. Like God allows us to speak our nonsense to him. We can bring that to God. You have to feel first before you can heal. So it's after you're allowed to feel, then you can begin to heal. It's then you begin to remember, okay, these feelings aren't facts. And then at some point, we do have to instruct our feelings with the truth. And that's exactly what David does. To get to the truth, you have to then go to the source. So look at what happens here, verse 3. So he says, look on me and answer, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death, and my enemy will say, I have overcome him. And my foes will rejoice when I fall. So there's a shift that begins to happen. David starts with lots of pain, but that pain turns into a petition, where now all of a sudden, or you could make the argument it's a plea, right? So he goes from despair, and now he's desperate for God to show up. He's got pain, but now it's a petition or a plea for God to interact, God to show up, for God to be a part of his situation, because he knows now his feelings are all over the place, and so he has to make an intentional choice. He can keep complaining, but if he keeps complaining, he will stay victim to his feelings. And the reality is, if you stay victim to your feelings too long, it will give you permission to either go numb or to have self-destructive choices. And so he makes this strategic decision to go from his inward spiraling, which is literally causing him to just feel like he's in this pit of despair, but instead now he decides to spiral up. He goes to upward prayer. So he takes his petition to God. And you see it right here in the text. He says, look on me, answer me, Lord my God. Keyword my. It's very personal for David because he's in relationship with God. He knows God. And so taking your grief to God is not a failure of faith. it's actually an expression of it, because you are taking your grief to the one person who can actually do something about it. And that's why he makes this prayer here. He says, give light to my eyes. Give light to my eyes. I think there's two ways for us to understand what he's praying for here. First of all, we know light to be a symbol of truth. And so he's asking for an illumination of truth in his life. He's asking God to help me see you, God. Help me see truth when all around me, all I see is darkness. When all around me, it seems like I'm consumed by the fog of this world, much like a pilot who is taught in survival training that they have to trust their visual instruments. And the reason they have to trust their visual instruments is because when they look at their outward surroundings, what may happen is they can experience spatial disorientation, where their body now feels like they're wonky, but they're actually level, or vice versa. They're going to think they're level when they're actually in a nosedive. And David is saying, help me see truth. Help me get level in spite of how I feel. I don't want my feelings to dictate my orientation. And this is why David is known as a worship leader, a songwriter. This is why he writes half of the Psalms. This is his anchor point of his soul. He uses worship and song to see the truth of God in his life. This is his visual instrumentation. And for us, we have to use the visual instruments that God has given us, because he's given us things to help us see truth, even if it feels like we're stuck in the dark. He's given us his word. And in his word are promises that we can come back to know that God is for us and that God is with us. He's giving us church and community, the ability to vent our feelings or to process our emotion with other people. And then he gives us the gift of worship, when we can, through song, express how we feel, sing songs and connect to and learn truths about God. And these are anchor points for us that will hold us steady or firm when we feel like we're in the middle of the storm. I would say another way to understand maybe his prayer is maybe through a phrase that we commonly use. It's part of our vernacular, but if you ever heard of somebody when they hear good news, or maybe they're hope-filled or they're excited about something they hear, a phrase that we use is we say, well, their eyes lit up. Their eyes lit up. I actually physically feel like I saw this with my mom about a month ago. My grandfather just passed away about a month or so ago as my mom's dad, and we saw somebody that actually looked just like my grandfather, my no-no. And when we saw him, I said, Mom, look, that looks just like no-no. That looks like your dad. And she turned and she looked at this guy, and her eyes lit up. She was so excited, and she walked over and she started talking to this guy. And even the ability to go and talk to this guy, it brought warmth to her soul for her to be able to process her grief, which in turn brought warmth to my soul. My eyes lit up when I saw her doing that. And so what David is saying, he's saying, God, give me some good news here. God, I need a win. God, light me up right now. And what's amazing is he has this pain that he turns into a plea. He's in despair, which becomes his desperation for God to show up. And God answers his prayer, because we see a turn now happen in the psalm where God actually lights David up. Verse 5, David says, but I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me. And so we start in pain. He makes a plea to God, and all of a sudden, it turns right here to praise. He's in despair. He's desperate for God to show up, and now he declares his trust in God. And you'd say, well, wait a minute here. How does this happen? Because this is it. This is the entire psalm. It's only 6 verses. The first 2 are the pain, the second 2 are the plea, and the last 2 are the praise. And you say, well, how does this happen? This seems kind of quick. Now, we don't know how long it took David to write this psalm. We don't know how long he was processing this pain or this sorrow or this sadness, but there is a key word here that I want us to see. But. So you say, how did this happen? Well, it happened because he turned the but around. Some of you are like, whoa, come again? What did you just say, Gregg? You heard me right. He turned the but around. I heard a story about a young woman who was leading a small group of girls. And as she led this small group of girls, this was a phrase that she would say to this young group of ladies as she was discipling them. She would say, turn the but around, because these girls, they would say things in their frustration or as they were venting or as they were talking, they'd say, oh, I know God loves me or he is faithful, but nobody cares or this will never end or things are so hard right now or boys are so stupid, which they are a lot of times. That's true. So she'd start though, or these kids, they'd start with something that was true about God's character, that God is good, but then they would end with their circumstances, and thus their circumstances are now dictating their outlook. Their circumstances are dictating how they feel. And she'd be like, no. Turn the but around. Start with how you feel. I feel alone. I feel like nobody cares, but God loves me, and God is faithful, and he is with me, and he will redeem me, and I know he fights for me, and I know he's got this. I will trust in him. You end with what you know is true about God, that his love never fails. And when we end with what's true, then now our outlook completely changes. It goes from pain to praise, because our circumstances are not dictating how we feel. The truth of who God is, the truth of his character, the truth of his nature, the truth of how he shows up is now dictating how we feel. And it's in these moments now that we can have hope even when it hurts. Yeah, does it still hurt? It hurts, but we can have hope because we know God is present. And we see that for David, because his grief is turning to trust. We see this word, I trust, right? And what's he trusting in? Well, he tells us right here, he's trusting in God's unfailing love. And if you were to look this up in the Hebrew, the word that's used is this word right here, hesed. Now, this word is not a love that we tend to throw around. This word has a richer, deeper meaning of what love is, because this is a covenantal love. This is a promise. This is a loyal love. This is a love that will never quit, a love that will never give up on you. And so what David is saying is, I trust that you are a God that keeps your promises. You do what you said you were going to do. You showed up then, you're going to show up now, because that's who you are, hesed, God's unfailing love. It's like what Corrie ten Boom said. There is no pit so deep that God's love is not deeper still. I am down, but I am not out, because God is with me. He met me in the pit. And you say, well, how can we know that God's love is faithful? How can we know that God's love is true? Well, we can know because we have Jesus. David didn't have Jesus. He had the promise of Jesus, but we got Jesus. Jesus is the physical manifestation of God's love in flesh and bone here on this planet. And so he came down and he got in the mess. But he was the son. We call him the son of sorrows, which means he did not keep our pain at a distance. He didn't come into this world as a guest. He didn't check in and check out. No. He came down into this world as one of us. He experienced sorrow. He experienced pain. He experienced heartbreak. He experienced death. He cried. He wept. He lamented. He gets it. But he didn't stop there. He goes and physically experiences death. He goes to a cross and dies, but that's not the end of the story, because we know that 3 days later, he rose from the dead. What does that tell us? That the mess and death are not the end of the story. So if you find yourself in sorrow or in sadness or in the mess or consumed by death, you have to understand that's not the end of the story. The resurrection is a promise, hesed, God's covenant to you, a promise of his faithful love that at some point, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, I hope it's sooner than later, but at some point, the resurrection is a promise that everything's gonna be all right. He will fix all that is wrong. He will redeem completely this broken world. He will wipe every tear from our eyes. And so I can have pain, and I can express how I feel, and then I can pray. And when I pray, I can know something, that I can have hope when it hurts. but it'll be okay. How do I know it'll be okay? He said, he's promised me his unfailing, faithful love. It's a covenant that we can hold firmly to. And so I want to listen to a song. It's a song that was written by a guy named Ryan Ellis. I came across this song this last week, and as I came across this song, I looked up the origin story of why he wrote this song, and come to find out that this guy wrote this song after he had the death of a child. And I can't even imagine what that grief and what that loss feels like. And so he wrote this song, and it was his way of holding on to God's promises and God's faithfulness and trusting in God. And he wrote it to help minister to his family and to his friends and really for himself. But when he realized how much this song impacted his family and friends and even himself, then he decided to record the song because he knew that this song could also help others. And so we're just going to listen to this song right now and let the lyrics of this song wash over us and begin maybe to process our grief. And everybody in this room, right? Some of us may be grieving something. Some of us may be grieving the loss of a loved one. Some of us, it's not a message we need right now. But we still need to tie ourselves to the hope that's connected to this song, the Hesed, the never-ending, powerful love of God, and know something to be true. And once again, there's no simple answers to grief, and so I'm not going to try to give you a simple answer, but we do need to anchor ourselves to truth and know that everything is going to be all right. Let me pray for you. God, thank you so much for what Jesus did. And Jesus, thank you so much for coming down and getting in the mess with us, for embracing our pain, walking in it, and showing us that you understand. And as there's people in this room wrestling with lots of different thoughts or emotions, loss, help them know that you are not only with them, but that you promise us that at some point, hopefully sooner than later, but for sure, everything's going to be all right. In the name of Jesus, I pray. Amen.